Good morning. We'll come on in and find our seat and we'll get started. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In just a moment, I'm going to begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll take a look, pick up where we left off. We're not too far into the chapter yet, but I would certainly like to cover a bit more ground this morning. I know it's a chapter that provokes a lot of thinking, a lot of questions, but not sure we'll settle every question everyone's ever had about this chapter in one class. So we'll do our best to try and cover some ground today. I certainly don't want to spend a month in this chapter, but we'll pick up there around verses 10, 11, 12 in that ballpark. But first, let's turn to God and offer thanks and begin the Lord's Day with a prayer directed to our Father in heaven. If you'd bow with me at this time. Our wonderful and awesome God, our great King in heaven above, we thank you so very much for this opportunity to be here, to meet in the comfort of this building, that we can, in this part of the world, come together as one family, as one body, worship you together, join our voices together in praise of your awesome nature and all the things you've done for us. We can give thanks for all of your kindness towards us, both in material ways and more importantly in spiritual ways. We thank you that we have this opportunity to remember you as we gather around the table in the next hour and think about the love poured out for us on the cross. We ask you now that you would bless us as we turn to your word and seek to understand the guidance that Paul gave to the Corinthians and how we can apply it and understand it and make use of it today, how we can let our light shine, that we could be a pillar of the truth as Paul was trying to remind the Corinthians to be the same. Pray that you'd bless each Bible class with our children that are learning very important things about you, that it would have an impact on them and they would learn lessons that would guide them for years to come. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, last week we looked at the first chunk of this text, and we noted that one of the difficulties among many in this chapter is trying to understand precisely what it is that they were asking. What is the question? What is at the heart of the question? Because Paul is addressing, now concerning things which you wrote to me, now concerning this, concerning that. Various topics he's going to address were brought to Paul's attention by the Corinthians. Everything prior to this was brought to Paul's attention probably by Chloe and her people. But this is the questions that they brought to Paul. And so we're trying to fill in some blanks and do our best to understand what kinds of questions might they be asking. And at the core of this chapter seems to be a discussion on celibacy. And so it touches on many other topics like marriage and some of the scenarios we talked about and began with, like verses 10 and 11, believers married to believers. Well, we're going to look at verses 12 through 16. What about a believer married to an unbeliever? So you're just going to apply these to different situations, but it seems like at the core, they want to know from verse 1, is it good for a man not to touch a woman? So rephrasing that, it just seems like they're asking, is it a good thing to be celibate? And what did Paul say in the first paragraph there, down through about verse 9? If you're married, what was his answer about celibacy? If you're married, it's not a good idea, except for a short time, both parties consenting, and because you're choosing to be dedicated to prayer. But otherwise, when we talk about the setting of marriage, so that's the first way Paul addresses this idea of celibacy. And when we move on, and so here's where we left off last week, verses 10 and 11. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. And we left off with discussion about this. So just remind ourselves that it's not that Paul, and I don't think any of us really think this, but it's not as if Paul is at odds with Jesus. Because in the next verse, in verse 12, well, not the Lord, but I say, it's not like Paul is trying to contradict or change something Jesus said, but it's simply, it could be just a matter of, go to Matthew 19, Matthew 5, Mark 10, any number of texts in the Gospels, and Jesus addressed this scenario But where did Jesus talk about a believer and an unbeliever married together? So it's not that Paul is at odds or contradicting. It's simply that as an apostle, it's their mission to be ambassadors, spokesmen for Jesus, and continue. That's what Jesus promised him. The Holy Spirit will guide you into all truth. Jesus didn't reveal everything to guide and direct the steps of the church during his short ministry, but he charged the apostles with that task. So that simply could be what's going on here. But even in these questions here, I'll just remind you, we covered 10 and 11 last week. It's really just a summary, like I said, of what Jesus taught in Matthew 19. Although perhaps the motivations are different here. What seems to be at the core, again, is this question of celibacy, whereas in Matthew 19, it seems like the Jews who were testing Jesus were coming at it from a different angle. They wanted to divorce not because, apparently, like the Corinthians, they thought this might be a better way to live. Celibate, single. They wanted to divorce because, well, can we marry someone else? And so it's the same teaching, but maybe different motivations with the Jewish audience in the Gospels versus the Corinthians. And you might have a different impression, but that's just the impression I get from reading this and trying to understand what question they were asking. Is celibacy, is that a good way to live? Is that better? And maybe this is an overcorrection of the pendulum swinging the other way. If you have people that are visiting temple prostitutes, and that's not okay, he covered that in chapter 6. Well, maybe you're more spiritual if you just do away with all that. Even in the context of marriage, we just do away with all the sexual relationship altogether and live celibate. Is that okay? Now, if you've never been married before, if you're single, Paul says that's probably better because of present distress. But let's get back into it now. Let's look at this scenario beginning in verse 12. So, let's see. Yeah, verses 10 through 16, this paragraph. We cover believer to believer, verses 10 and 11, and it's a very simple, straightforward summary of what Jesus taught. No, you should not divorce. If you're married, it's supposed to be a lifelong union. And Paul just reinforces the instruction from Jesus. But what about an unbeliever? And you can start to see where I kind of understand where they might be rationalizing this kind of question. What if I'm married to an unbeliever? I mean, you just talked about that in the previous chapter, that you should not be joined to a harlot. And, well, what if I'm joined to an unbeliever? Does that somehow kind of dirty my soul or make me sinful? That's what I think could be at the heart of the question. But let's read verses 12 through 16 and make some observations. But to the rest I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a man who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. All right, pretty straightforward so far. Again, it's not that surprising whether you're talking about Jesus or the apostles in the rest of the New Testament. Divorce is, generally speaking, not what is recommended, right? Jesus said, can you divorce for any reason? No, stay married. And they seem to be asking a question about this. What if I'm married to an unbeliever? Well, if they consent, don't divorce. There's no reason to. So stay married. Let's read on a little bit further. Verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, well, we'll look at verse 15 and 16 next, but I want to ask a question about verse 14. What do you make of this idea that the unbelieving husband is sanctified by his wife and the unbelieving wife sanctified by the husband, and then about the children being unclean or clean? What do you make of that? Brady, what do you think?
I'll start with what it doesn't mean.
Okay, and that sometimes is the best place to begin, what it does not mean. Right. You were not saved by proxy of your marriage.
First of all, because they're still called unbelievers.
Yeah.
Specifically in the verse, you can't have an unbelieving person saved. Contradicts
Right.
Although I don't know, but out of an idea, sanctified means set apart. You are set apart in a marriage with someone who is willing to stay with you, and you can enjoy the benefits of living with someone who is a Christian, behaves in a Christian way, follows God's principles. Set aside in that relationship.
Yeah.
They are receiving a good thing. They are set aside in that sense. Now, that's just one idea.
Yeah, and I might not have worded it exactly that way, but I wouldn't say I think necessarily differently about it. I like the way you worded that, because sanctified, let's all agree that's not a salvation statement. Sanctified is not about saved or lost. It's about set apart. You think about the utensils and the items inside the tabernacle or inside the temple. They're sanctified. They're set apart for a special purpose. And so if we talk about this marriage, I would say is sanctified by God. The fact that you're married to an unbeliever doesn't make it less of a marriage. So you are set apart, or your spouse is set apart for that relationship. And it is, in the eyes of God, fully approved, might be one way to kind of take that. Gil, what do you want to add?
Well, I agree with that. I could expand it just a little bit. I think in verse 14, he tells us why he was saying what he says. Otherwise, your children are unclean. Well, Grant's thinking has changed, but I don't think God's thinking
Yeah.
has changed. Children that were born out of wedlock at that time were castigated. They were cut
Yeah.
off. And what I see him saying here is, otherwise you're causing problems with your children. And when you combine that with what you and Brady just said, I think it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, so the idea of your children would be, otherwise your children would be unclean. I kind of took that interpretation as well, the idea of would they be legitimate or illegitimate? And so you leave your wife and the children or whatever, and so they're sort of in that stigma of being illegitimate children now, or illegitimate heirs or something like that. And so we certainly don't want to take these verses to suggest salvation. You follow it?
Yeah, there's one other thing to add to that. Look at the legality of that time. If the man divorces the woman, well, man, everything's centered around man.
Property rights, everything went to the man. That's just how it worked back then.
And so what happens to the children if they were the wife? They're cut off too.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's what's under consideration here. Now, does this have implications about the unbelieving spouse or the unbelieving children? Does this have implications about their salvation? Yes. Let's read on the next two verses. It certainly does have some implications, but simply staying married to an unbeliever does not save them. But separating or divorcing them sort of closes the door on that possibility. That's what I get out of these next two verses. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? So, it seems to be saying that there's no guarantees, but if they want to stay with you, there's no reason to end it. It might lead to their salvation. It could lead to their salvation. But what about this? You could read that another way, is you're not under bondage if they don't want to stay married. How do you know if you're going to save them? You might not save them. That could be the other way to look at it too. Let's look at verse 15 in a little more detail here. I think, did I break this word down a little bit here? Yeah. So bondage. This is an interesting verse. This is one of those messy verses, right? It's open to a little bit of grammatical interpretation. I'll just suggest some possibilities and leave it at that. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. That word bondage, I think it's worth pointing out. It's not the same word that we see used throughout the chapter. For example, at the end of chapter 7, verse 39, a wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. So does this talk about the marriage bond? He is not bound by marriage, or is this talking about something else? That's a question that is greatly debated amongst believers. Like I said, I will just show some information and leave it at that. Bondage here is, you can see doulo in the middle. Doulos, that's the word translated slave throughout the New Testament. However, even in the same chapter, even though it's in English, it still talks about bond. It's a different word that's used to describe the marriage bond. Or verse 27 is another one. Are you bound to a wife? That doesn't mean enslaved. This word literally means enslaved. So you could think about it. If the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not enslaved in such cases. So you might read that as bound by marriage, or you might read that as enslaved. I am not a confident enough Greek expert to tell you how you should read this. Enslaved to what is the question? Gil, you look like you're ready to chime in.
There is a difference in the idea. One is bond, marriage, the legality. You're married. You have a legal contract with your wife.
Yeah.
The other one is talking about the context of what he's just said. But it's not your own. It's your spouse's. There is a bondage of slavery that you have in that union that is
Yeah.
beyond the legality of the contract.
Being bound together, Jessica and I are bound together, but that doesn't make her my slave.
Exactly.
Subtle difference that might have some different implications. But to Brady's question, enslaved to what? I would suggest one possible interpretation is if an unbelieving spouse does not, what does it say? If they depart, let them depart. I could see this as a scenario, a very likely scenario. Well, we're not going to be going to that church. We're not going to be following those Christians. Come on, you're not going to church anymore. But what do you do if your spouse tells you that?
They left. I tell you that person departed. They're gone.
Yeah, it's an interesting, like I said, it's one of those messy verses. Did they depart because? And now they're not under bondage because that's what caused the departure in the first place, was a kind of a gap in the beliefs. And you could see where this would come from. Let's say, you're Corinthian, marriage is for producing legitimate children, but for sexual gratification, you go to the temple of Aphrodite. And that's not what marriage is about. But now all of a sudden your spouse is saying, well, no, that's what we believe now. I didn't sign up for that. It creates a scenario where you're leaving Christ or I'm leaving you. Are you enslaved to leave Christ because, well, that's my spouse? That's, like I said, it's a messy verse, but that is one way you could certainly look at it. But again, the teaching here is fairly simple. If your spouse leaves you or departs from you, a little bit out of your hands. If they don't want to leave, don't divorce. So that's the constant takeaway from this chapter is don't divorce. Marriage is intended to be a permanent bond, and just having one believer and one unbeliever doesn't change that dynamic. Unless the unbeliever leaves. Right. Well, and I'll add something to this, like verse 16, how do you know? So you could look at that as a positive or a negative. You might save them. So don't divorce them because you might save them. And that's true. Romans chapter 11 is a good idea here. When Paul talks about his relationship with his Jewish kinsmen, Romans chapter 11, let's see, verse 13. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh and save some of them. There's no guarantee that Paul's strategy will save his Jewish kinsmen, but then he goes on to talk about how, well, if branches were cut off and wild branches were grafted in, it would be easy. How much more easy would it be to take the original branch and graft it back to the original tree? Like, if I can provoke them to jealousy and save some of them, it can happen, but Paul understands there's no guarantees. So that's a little bit of what's going on in verse 16 as well, when he says, who knows whether you save your spouse, wife or husband. Ed? Yeah.
They end up leaving Christ themselves. I think our young people are listening. Not a good idea. I think you're going to take some hiker, marry him, say, come on and let's go to church. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
I think we need to hold the line when it comes to marriage.
Yeah, and that's going to come up at the end of the chapter. You look at verse 39 when he talks about widows. He says they're free. I'm giving them the advice that you, because of present distress, you're better off to not marry if you're a widow. But he says you're at liberty to, if that's your choice. But he says in verse 39, she's at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. That's another one of those head scratchers, messy verses, open to a couple of possible interpretations. But one of the likely interpretations is, if you're going to marry, you should marry a believer. Now, is that an absolute? That's the debate we'll get into when we get to verse 39. But there's no debate that is solid advice, and that is probably what you should do. Ed is right to bring up how, and I would say in this scenario here, we're talking about likely people that were already married and one of them was converted and the other was not. But that does piggyback into more modern situations of a believer who willingly chooses to marry an unbeliever, which I think is what Paul is addressing there in verse 39. So Ed brings up some good concerns from this text as well. But again, that's Paul's advice. If the unbeliever is consenting and has no desire to depart from you, then you don't have any reason to send them away or depart yourself. Brady?
So the fun debate is in verse 15, if you will, but we don't want to lose the forest of the trees here. Every circumstance, and this is with the exception of 15, is stay. You do what a Christian has always done, about following God has always done, you stay. I hate divorce, you stay.
Yeah.
You got 15 problematic verse. We don't want to lose, as you said, the overall message is to stay.
Yeah, and we're trying to understand particular situation with the Corinthians, particular distress, that flavors some of the instruction here, but generally speaking, that is the constant takeaway throughout this chapter. So Paul has addressed a believer and a believer. No, celibacy is not preferred. Celibacy is not preferred. A believer and an unbeliever. No, again, you're not more spiritual or more righteous or in a better position necessarily if you divorce. That's not what he recommends there. He addresses, well, what about the very real possibility of your believing spouse that says, I didn't sign up for this? That's a very real scenario that they would face. So he addressed that in verse 15. Now, verse 17 through 24 is where he gives some examples to drive home the point he's making. Yes? It would just... Well, Gil pointed this out. There's kind of a stigma that isn't quite the same today, and just trying to understand it in its original context, that makes a lot of sense to me in that culture, especially. Not that there isn't a carryover to today, but it's this idea of illegitimizing the children is kind of my takeaway. Gil, did you clarify that a little bit?
The difference is whether or not the son
Yeah, I agree. I don't believe it is speaking about spiritually unclean.
And the world views them as being unclean. And the legality of it would be they have no rights to whatever Paul has.
Yeah, so it sort of delegitimizes the children, and I wouldn't say it's a spiritually unclean or clean before God. It's not a spiritual concern. It's a worldly perception. I would agree with that. Mike? Yeah. Right. Well, and the child that's in the situation, they can't control what stigma society places on them. And they tried to do that to Jesus, you remember. The Pharisees looked at him and said, "We were not born of adultery." And that was, in my mind, a subtle dig at perhaps the perception that Jesus was born out of adultery. And so they were trying to put that stigma on him. So I think that definitely was a stigma that was there in that first century. All right, verses 17 through 24, he gives some applications. All right. I would say probably, yeah. I mean, he goes back to the beginning of Adam and Eve, so there's certainly... Well, in verses 10 and 11, he's reinforcing Jesus, and I think he's clarifying situations that maybe Jesus did not specifically address. The particulars. Jesus was... Yes, there is application to all marriages, but Jesus was specifically talking to a Jewish audience and looking at their interpretation of the law. Why then did Moses permit? That's sort of what their question is filtered through. So yes, he is talking about, from the beginning, Adam and Eve, but there is some specificness to the Jewish audience that Jesus addressed. So a little of both, I guess, is my answer. Sorry if that's not terribly helpful. But look at verses 17 and 24. I want to keep moving. I want to cover some ground in this chapter. He gives some illustrations to drive home the point. And what's really going on here is the Corinthians are concerned about their perception in the world around them. How are we viewed? But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. Was anyone called well circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called well uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. So this is about changing your standing in the world. Which again, now that I'm a Christian, does this mean I need to change my marriage status? Do I need to be single? Do I need to be celibate? Well, when you look at questions like this, circumcised or uncircumcised, and sparing you some details, there actually was a procedure back then where they would attempt to reverse circumcision, because for a Jew that lived in a Greek or Gentile culture, there was that pressure to conform. So that was something that was possible. But he says also, if you're uncircumcised, don't seek to become circumcised. So that doesn't matter. Don't change that to alter your social status or alter your standing in the public eye. And then he adds to it, verse 19, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. So we're talking about, as far as spiritual standing, to kind of go along with this idea of clean or unclean, sanctified or unsanctified. We're still not talking about spiritual standing here, because he says it's nothing. Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called is in the Lord, while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. So just adding a little bit of perspective to it. Again, saying, how does being a Christian impact my standing as a slave or as a freed person? It says it's really kind of a non-issue. If you want to be free and you have the opportunity, that's probably better. Good. But don't look at that as something you have to do, that if you're a slave, well, Christ has set me free, I have to be free in real life. I can't be a slave anymore because I'm Christ. Well, no, you're Christ's slave. And if you are a slave, Christ has set you free. It's all relative. It's kind of a non-issue. Don't feel like you have to change your social standing just because you're a Christian now. And that's where he comes back in verse 22. For he who is called in the Lord, verse 23. You were bought at a price, do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. And you can see how that relates back to maybe this initial question, should we become celibate? No. Just like if you're circumcised, don't seek to reverse it. If you're a slave, don't feel like you have to find your freedom. If you're married, don't feel like you need to change that because you're a Christian now. Any questions, comments on that paragraph? It's kind of an odd one, but I see the connection I think Paul is trying to make there. Gil?
I think Paul's making a statement here in the negative, saying just because you come to God, been called and you become a Christian, doesn't give you license to change all this other stuff.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean you have to make all those changes.
But the reverse is saying, hey, if you come to God, you're not married, you can't get there. That's not what he's saying. So the idea is just the thought in the negative, not the positive. Come to God, you're not married, you want to get married, get married.
Yeah.
Don't stay the way you are. But you can't use coming to God as a license.
Right, and yeah, in any of these verses, just because he cites some, like verse 11, even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. That's not giving us free license that, well, I can just separate and that's fine. Okay, look, there's all kinds of what-if scenarios, and I'm not going to get into what-ifs this morning, but this isn't, let's just be clear, this isn't giving free license that, well, that's what you should do. That's not what you should do. I'm not covering every possible what-if you could think of, but just I'm speaking in general ideas here, general principles. This is not giving us free license, and Gil makes some good observations there. Becoming a Christian doesn't mean you have to change these things. And now we're going to get into verse 25 through the end, where he really brings in this, let's bring in another layer to this, present distress. Because that's the next progression of this argument. Remain in the condition you're called. Well, what if you're unmarried but want to become married? That's fine. You're not breaking any laws. You're not breaking any rules, but because of present distress, you probably shouldn't. So that's what we're going to look at now, verse 25 through the end of the chapter. So you can see how this really goes through this progression here. Now, fun question, verse 25. Now, concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. So, Paul can tell them, here's what you should do, but I'm not telling you it's what you must do. But this idea of virgins, or if anyone here has the ESV, there might be a handful of other translations that say betrothed. It's kind of like the Venn diagram where the circles overlap. They can be distinct, but they can have some similar properties. Generally speaking, if you're betrothed, it means you're a virgin. You've never been married before. So it could just mean virgin, or it could mean betrothed, and there's a little overlap between those two concepts, but I think whichever word you look at slightly alters the particulars of this chapter, but doesn't ultimately change the overall teaching here. But if it is betrothed, and contextually that makes a lot of sense to me, but I'm not at all telling you that's what you must interpret it as. That makes some sense to me, but it doesn't fit our customs today, right? Betrothal was a lot more binding. We don't even use the word betrothed today. What would be sort of the modern equivalent of betrothal? Engagement. There's nothing legally binding about engagement. There's a giving of a ring, and the expectation is if the engagement's broken off, I want it back. But there's nothing legally binding about engagement. Now, betrothal, what's the classic example in Jewish culture that you could think of in the Bible of betrothal? Joseph and Mary. All right. So she was found to be with child, and he wanted to put her away. Sort of the language of divorce. Well, but they aren't married yet. See, betrothal carried with it a heavier, that as we talked about earlier, the binding, the legal side of it that Gil mentioned. But until the marriage ceremony, they weren't living together, they hadn't consummated the marriage. So this could be the particular situation that Paul has in view here, and that makes sense to me contextually. But again, I'm not telling you that's the one and only way you have to understand this text. But if we're talking about betrothed, that is a scenario where I am bound to this person, but we aren't necessarily husband-wife yet. Well, what do I do, Paul? I'm kind of in limbo here. Do I go forward and get married, or do I remain celibate? And again, Paul said, no, celibacy isn't going to make you spiritually superior, but there are some practical reasons why it could be good. So let's read on a little bit further and look at his advice. And again, how you read virgin versus betrothed might flavor the text a little differently for you, but ultimately I don't think it's going to make a huge difference to the overall point that Paul is going to make here. So verse 26, I suppose therefore that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. So if you're betrothed but not full-fledged married, remain as he is. That could be what Paul is saying. Or, again, if it's virgin, it really means essentially the same thing, but you're taking out that legal binding part of it. But it effectively means the same thing. If you're a virgin, remain as you are because of present distress. Now, I don't know what present distress this is, like historically. Corinthians is probably one of the earlier epistles, so we're still 20-something years away from Jerusalem being destroyed, but you've got Nero, persecuted Christians. You've got some historical dates on the calendar that could fit, but just trying to pinpoint which one he means precisely, I'm not entirely sure, but I kind of look at this as persecution. That makes sense to me. We're not talking about famine or something else. I think persecution, we know that's on the horizon for Christians, especially Jewish Christians. If anyone else has a different take on that, I'd love to hear it, but if we can't pinpoint it, he is definitely talking about difficult times are approaching, and because of that, it's good for a man to remain as he is. So are you bound to a wife? And here's where it's interesting, because now concerning virgins, why is he talking about wife? I thought we were concerning virgins. See, that's why I lean towards this, with the ESV, with this idea of we're looking at the betrothal situation, because just like Joseph and Mary, he wanted to put her away like divorcing his wife. Well, they weren't strictly speaking husband-wife yet. That's why I think it, because we go from concerning virgins to, are you bound to a wife? Well, if this is the betrothal, are you bound but not married yet? Well, do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But again, at face value, it sure sounds like, are you single or are you married? If you're single, don't seek a wife. If you're married, don't seek to be loosed from your wife. So again, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what is being stated here, but both interpretations don't really change it drastically. So verse 28, again, I think it comes back to this idea of why I see betrothal here. But even if you do marry, it's because you're in the situation where you are contemplating a marriage or you are on the cusp of marriage. If you choose to marry, you've not sinned. So if you're betrothed and you go through with it, you're not sinning. You haven't done anything wrong. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, and I would spare you. Now, Paul, let's be clear. Paul is not being anti-marriage here. He's not saying, look, I'm trying to save you from the headache of marriage. You don't want a wife, trust me. I don't think that's what he's saying here. But he's saying because of present distress. And he goes on to elaborate that. That's why I think especially the second half is really strongly influenced his teaching here. And he said, I'm not giving you commandment here, I'm giving you judgment. I'm giving you good advice from someone who knows some things about some things. I'm an apostle, right? I've got the Holy Spirit. But it's not commandment here, but because of present distress. You want to marry? I'm not telling you you've sinned. But you need to consider how difficult a path that is going to be for you. And so he elaborates, verse 29, but this I say, brethren, that the time is short, so that from now on even those who have wives should be as though they had none, those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, and those who buy as though they did not possess. Time is short. It could be this idea of imminent, or it could be less of a quantitative and more of a qualitative property here. Think like, anyone remember the Tim McGraw song, Live Like You Were Dying? And we talked about he got the diagnosis and he just started living like he had never lived before because felt like the time was short. So it could be kind of either way, but he could just be saying that things are going to change. If you want to get married and just assume that life's going to go on the way it is, you need to think again, the time is short and things are going to be drastically different. I find these verses kind of difficult to explain in detail, but when you take a step back and just look at the general teaching here, he's just saying life isn't going to carry on day to day like you've known it. Things are going to change drastically for you. So however you might interpret the details, I think that's the general instruction here in this passage. So verse 32, but I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. And that makes sense. If you're going through persecution, which historically would happen not too far from now, and you're married and you have kids, and, well, you need to denounce your God and worship Caesar as God, or we'll kill your children. Well, what are you going to do in that situation? You see how much more complex that situation becomes. You think about all the things that Paul faced as an apostle. He's going to write about that in the next letter. I've been shipwrecked. I've been spent a couple nights floating in the sea. I've been hungry. I've been cold. I've been miserable. I've been stoned and left for dead on occasions. I've been beaten. I've been whipped. He talks about all the hardships he's experienced, and all those issues would be magnified times 100 if he had the concerns of a wife and children. Now, Paul isn't putting down being married and having children, and that's why he said at the beginning, not everyone's like me. It's not everyone's gift. But he's just simply saying that based on the present distress, you're going to have all kinds of concerns that are going to make it more, it's just going to complicate things for you because of present distress. All right. What questions, comments, observations do you guys have in this text? What do you see here that catches your attention? That's sort of the direction I'm interpreting this as I read through it. There's present distress, and this is simply good advice based on what's coming.
Think about World War II. It was an uncertain time. Who's going to go off? Who's going to come back? Who's going to not go back?
Yeah.
I suspect a lot of parents at that time said, let's slow down. It's really a good idea in the circumstances. Who waits after the war? So things are uncertain. Think about what you're doing. Perhaps not the best move to make.
Yeah, and so World War II is a pretty good historical comparison that, boy, that really complicated things, and when the war was brought right to all these villages and towns in Europe, and then people were marrying before being sent off to war, and it really does complicate things. Again, to be clear, Paul says you're not sinning if you choose to get married. Verse 34, there's a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord. that she may be holy both in body and in spirit, but she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, that you may serve the Lord without distraction. And even taking the distress factor out of it, there is some practicality to it. In some ways, if I were a single man, I'd be a lot more available at the drop of a hat to go meet people or go help people in situations or go study with people any and all hours of the day. But right now, I've got limitations. I don't want to be away from my kids all the time. I don't want to sacrifice them on the altar of ministry. I've got those concerns. That doesn't mean I'm better or worse for being married or single. There's things about being married and having kids that helps me as a preacher, but I can see what Paul might be getting at here too. Ed? Mm-hmm. Forcing celibacy, and we talked about that last week, 1 Timothy 4, that's one of the departures from the faith that you would see in the coming days, is people that insisted or taught celibacy is refusing or rejecting marriage for people. And when it's forced on a whole group of people like the clergy, it has mixed results, to say it politely, really disastrous at times. So yes, that is not the ideal. All right, we'll try to wrap up this chapter next week and look at a little bit more to say about, again, verse 36. If a man thinks he's behaving improperly toward his virgin or betrothed, that sort of flavors the text a little differently. And then we'll look at his instructions for widows and getting remarried at the end of the chapter. All right, thank you, everybody.